Hello, good morning, and welcome to the ABCs of CLC webinar series. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist for Texas System of Care. We have a webinar series called the ABCs of CLC, and today's episode is going to be terminology relevant to working with the African American population. So if you're familiar with our series, you may have seen the first few slides, but it is important to review some of this information with each of our episodes. So first of all, the purpose of our overall series is to provide very, very basic, kind of 101 level, very foundational information to clarify different terms that you may hear in cultural competence trainings that go more in depth into actual concepts. From this episode, you are not going to walk away with more actual skills or, real deeper understanding for practical application in working with the African American population. That is not what this webinar series is about and not what we claim it to be. It really is to just kind of get out there in the clear to make sure that folks are on the same page about what different terms mean. Sometimes in more in-depth cultural competence trainings, it can be assumed that everyone is on the same page about different terms or phrases, and then they're not. And then when we get kind of deeper into the bread and butter of content, their issues can arise with different understandings of what different things may mean. So that's really the main purpose and emphasis behind this series. The series is specifically created for use within Texas System of Care, again, as sort of a prerequisite or a suggested first step before more intensive cultural competence trainings that we do offer. However, the information should be beneficial for anyone who works within the helping professions, especially as some of that foundational information for more intensive information. We have a few different uses for the series. First of all, to either learn in the first place what the meanings of different words or phrases may be, or to review that terminology if the information isn't necessarily new to you, or potentially to provide just a little bit more clarification on something that perhaps you for the most part knew, but there's just maybe some nuance there to clarify. Hopefully this also will inspire deeper learning. Again, I really can't stress enough how kind of 101 level this information is. Please, please, please don't view this webinar series as something to sort of check the box for your professional development within the realm of cultural competence. It's really a first step, basic information that, again, not everyone necessarily knows what these different words or phrases may mean, or at least they may not necessarily know what they mean within the context of what an instructor providing a cultural competence training probably is intending that to be. So hopefully, this is encouragement for just a first step or a next step in your continued learning. The series can also be used to potentially raise red flags within your own knowledge base. If the information provided is overall very new or very different than you had previously thought in regards to working with individuals or working with families or communities as a whole, then red flag that. You likely do have a lot more learning, a lot more work ahead of you in becoming increasingly more competent. Now, everyone always has more to learn, especially cross-culturally, in regards to being effective, being respectful, being appropriate in working with individuals. So, that's going to be an ongoing process for everybody, but especially, like I said, if in one of the episodes of this series it is very new information, or you come away still confused or unclear about certain things, that's not something to be ashamed by, but that's something to be aware of. And I hope that is encouragement to really, really pursue other opportunities and continue in your learning. And at the end of this webinar, we will have contact information shown, so we can certainly try to provide some resources if that's the case. Now finally, before actually digging into some of the words we're going to go over today, we always have to do a disclaimer. And I cover a few things over and over again in each episode with this because it's all very important. First of all, language changes over time, and that is going to be true across the board. That's just the nature of language. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just what happens. But especially sometimes in the area of, we live in a multicultural society. We live in a society that has a really long history of oppression, discrimination. We have ongoing issues with that. And some of that includes majority culture having imposed labels on entire communities and groups of people. And so sometimes language may appear to change a little bit more rapidly in the realm of cultural competence and making sure that we're respectful in the way that we communicate about groups of people when we're having these different discussions, because there's a process of these communities reclaiming and putting out there for themselves how they want to be identified and referred to, instead of this oppressive, labeling that unfortunately has happened and continues to happen. So sometimes I have conversations with folks who feel very frustrated by the fact that language does indeed change, and again, specifically in this realm, it can seem like it changes more frequently than other areas in our English language. But that comes with the territory of being a helping professional and being respectful, being sensitive, treating people like people, and in general, honestly, just not being a jerk. Don't be a jerk. If people want to be referred to using certain terminology or phrasing, because that's going to be a respectful way to refer to, either them as an individual or the community, whatever the case may be, then, do it. It can sometimes feel a little overwhelming and can feel like it's hard to keep up on, but there are resources available for that continued learning. And again, please feel free to reach out to us if you would like any more assistance with that. Another disclaimer is that sometimes there are terms that at one time were appropriate to use, and over time they're no longer appropriate to use. And that can range from just sort of not being quite the best phrasing at this point, all the way to that used to be acceptable, now it's outright offensive. And then, of course, there are those words that were always offensive to begin with in the first place. We don't necessarily take the time to cover the bad words because people tend oftentimes to know what the outright bad, never were good words are. But we may point out, hey, in some episodes, this word isn't necessarily outright terrible, super no offensive, but it's not quite the best any longer. And again, that just goes back to that humility of understanding that language changes for various different reasons, and we need to strive to be respectful. Alrighty, so let's start digging into some of the actual words that we have planned for today. The first two are actually throwbacks to our first webinar episode that was called This versus That, where we compared different words or phrases that oftentimes are easy to mix up, or there's not a lot of clarification about the difference between the two. And so one this versus that comparison that I wanted to recycle for this episode is the difference between stereotype and generalization. When we are talking about a community as a whole, that's all generalizations. This webinar today is one big, huge generalization after another. So it's incredibly important to understand the difference between generalization and stereotype. So first of all, talking about stereotypes. Stereotypes are our beliefs or thoughts about a group of people that is very, very rigid. There's not, there's no wiggle room or grain of salt or anything like that. They are often thought of or developed about a group of people from outside that group. So outsiders kind of looking at a community of people are making judgments about that group that results in the stereotypical thinking. And stereotypes often are, they're not based on actual, research. They're not based on the voice of the actual members of that community. So they're things that if you were to ask members of that community, is this something that represents your people group? Is this something that really, really represents, who you are as a people? They would say, no, that's a stereotype. That is sometimes painful, hurtful, is a throwback to incredibly, racist or homophobic or whatever the case may be, thinking, and is not appropriate. So that's sort of some of the characteristics of a stereotype when we're talking about different community groups. As opposed to a generalization, which, as I mentioned before, we're going to be doing a lot of today, and honestly, this whole webinar series, a lot of generalizations are made. Generalizations, unlike stereotypes, are more fluid and loose, and there is that grain of salt disclaimer of this isn't going to be true for absolutely every single individual member of this community all of the time. It is, just as it sounds, in general, kind of typically going to be the case, but you still need to get to know the person individually. Generalizations are also, as opposed to stereotypes, things that if you asked members of the community that is being discussed, is this something that tends to be true of your community group? That person would say, yes, that is generally reflective of my community group. It may or may not represent me. That may or may not necessarily be my perspective or my values or my worldview, but in general, yes, that does tend to be true. And it's, like I mentioned before, anytime that we're discussing different populations or community groups, it's really important that we all keep clear in our heads that we are talking in generalizations, not in stereotypes. Okay, specific to the African American community, the first couple of words that I wanted to clarify and provide some more context for are the difference between the word Black and African American. Some folks don't know which is appropriate. Is there an appropriate one? Are they interchangeable? Or do they mean exactly the same thing? So just a minute to provide some clarification on that and the different ways that persons may use the two or interchange the two at times. So Black is a kind of a larger overarching term for persons who are either they themselves are from the continent of Africa or they are descendants of persons from Africa. The majority of folks living in the United States who are Black are descendants of Africa, who their ancestors were brought here against their will forcibly through chattel slavery. However, there are also folks in the United States who they have actually more recently, they themselves come from Africa, or their descendants came originally to somewhere else in the Americas, Central or South America or the Caribbean, from Africa, again through chattel slavery or later on otherwise. And so within this, larger Black community, there's tons of diversity in regards to nationalities, different ethnicities within this, larger overarching term. There is also sort of a sense of unity of the Black experience, the experience of being Black, which includes but not limited to being Black in the U.S. There's also just being Black in a larger sense in the world. The impact of that transatlantic slave trade time period, there were ramifications not only in the United States, but in other areas that slaves were brought to of the Americas, and then also long-term ramifications within the continent of Africa, implications on different politics, the economics, the sociocultural issues there, other colonialism issues and genocide that was taking place during that time period that was related to, but perhaps, technically separate from the transatlantic slave trade, and just what it means to, be a person with the physical characteristics of a Black individual living in our global society today. That time period of not only slavery, but also that time period of the pseudoscience of creating a hierarchy, a false hierarchy of human beings, and assigning the lowest value and worth to Black individuals, that has long-term ramifications, has had long-term ramifications, globally, not only within the United States. So there's this kind of common Black experience. Aside from all that negative aspect of it too, there's also a common Black experience as far as different values and strengths and worldview that we're going to be taking a look at some of that today. So sometimes when folks prefer the term Black, it can be because they don't necessarily identify, and I'll expand on this in a moment when I go over the term African American. They may not completely identify as actually being African American, or they do, but within certain contexts at certain times, they're speaking to their identification with this larger Black world community type of a thing, with specifically roots to Africa. Whereas the term African American, and here on the slide I'm showing specifically African American leaders, is it tends to be, and there's some fluidity with this as well. It's not necessarily super strict one or the other necessarily, but this would tend to be individuals who have been born and raised, or at least primarily raised, within the United States, who have ancestry from Africa. Again, either going back to that time of chattel slavery, with their ancestors being forced to come over during that time period, or since that time, ancestors immigrating from Africa. So going back a minute ago, what I was saying about, some folks might prefer at times saying Black or African American type of a thing. What I was saying before about persons who have maybe more recently immigrated from Africa or from other countries as well, Central South America, the Caribbean, they may or may not necessarily identify as African American. And the reason for that is, yes, there is this overarching Black experience and identity and kind of, common value system and all that, but also African American, it does have a very unique life experience to it, of actually having been born and raised in our society with this country's specific history and this country's ongoing cross-cultural and racial issues that we have, where an individual, let's say maybe from Jamaica or Nigeria or something, they may not really identify completely as being African American. They might identify as being Black, or they might identify as being Jamaican American or Nigerian American or something like that, but they may not necessarily feel completely part entirely of being within the African American community. Hopefully I'm making sense with that. Likewise, some individuals are going to very much prefer the term Black over African American. Others may prefer the term African American over Black. Some individuals are potentially going to use the terms somewhat interchangeably. However, there's also oftentimes, people will use one term in certain contexts and another term in other contexts. And there's this subtle, a little bit of a nuance, very, very purposeful reason within different contexts that one word might be used over the other, that if you're not kind of in tuned to these different dynamics of larger worldwide Black experience versus more localized experience of being Black in the United States, it can just kind of go over your head pretty easily. But folks will sometimes very purposefully in different contexts use one word versus the other. So they do have different meanings. They are both generally socially acceptable to use if you want to refer to a community. But if we are being very technical and textbook about it, Black is larger encompassing, whereas African American is specifically folks who identify in that way. Okay, next, this is actually a diagram that, I'm a visual learner, and so I think that this from Dana is going to assist a lot in understanding the bulleted list later on of other terms. So we're going to have a little bit of overlap in terms, but I think that's okay. So this diagram basically is a depiction of, again, talking in generalizations, right, all throughout this. Generalizations, not going to be true for absolutely everyone within this community, but how typically an Afrocentric worldview is regarding how an individual understands themselves and their identities and their kind of, place in the world or the family unit, kind of an understanding of self. So we can see from the diagram that there is a very, very strong integral connection between the individual person and nuclear family. And I want to point out that these terms, the nuclear family and the extended family and all that, there's fluidity to that. The individual is who defines who that nuclear family is and who that extended family is, versus a more, Eurocentric worldview, basically meaning, the way white people see the world, would define nuclear family specifically as the, 1 degree separation, your parents, your siblings, your children. That's pretty much it, right? So grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, those are all more extended family. Not necessarily so in an African American worldview. So that sense of self, there's a lot of cohesion within that. There's a lot of unity between the person and their nuclear family. Again, nuclear family might be defined a little bit differently than in a Eurocentric worldview. And then one step out from that, pretty stinking close, but one step out of that from the sense of self is the extended family. And if you'll notice on the diagram, we have extended family to the left, fictive kin or non-biological family to the right at the same level. And so yet again, here's the difference where bloodline isn't necessarily the most important thing. You will have your extended family that technically you are biologically related to, as well as your family that you're not technically biologically related to, but they have the same standing. So that family is it's not really defined by the blood and the DNA and all of that. It's defined by who has, who you're in it with, and that doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you're related to. And as far as worldview, obviously folks are cognitively aware of the difference between being blood related and not blood related, but as far as value, as far as life investment, as far as being there for each other, that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of emphasis. That idea of blood is thicker than water, it's not really a thing so much. And then we also have some other very important values stemming out of the individual and nuclear family that builds into this sense of self and how the individual relates with the world and society. So we have spirituality, church, and Afrocentricity. So Afrocentricity is, I think I might have used the word already, it's essentially seeing the world through the perspective of Africa, stemming back to values and family dynamics and just in general understanding, learning processes, so on and so forth from an African point of view as opposed to a Eurocentric perspective, which our systems and our institutions have been built up in the United States using a very Eurocentric worldview. So Afrocentricity is going to vary a lot from person to person. There are African American folks who the worldview of the individual is very Afrocentric, but the person has to, when engaging with society in the U.S., because it's so Eurocentric, has to kind of like code switch and, fit that. And so at school or at work, you may have to behave or, communicate and, just kind of work with things a certain way, but then back at home with their family, in the neighborhood, in the community, can revert back to the more natural for that person, more Afrocentric way of looking at things or valuing things or managing things or whatever the case may be. But, again, that's going to vary. There are also African American individuals that their upbringing has been very Eurocentric, more so. And so there's a scale with that of how to view the world. What is common amongst all African Americans and really all groups within the United States is the need to be able to function within a very Eurocentric society, with very Eurocentric systems. And so because of that, I'm going to go back in a second to spirituality and church. But while I'm on this point, I want to show, and I'm only showing this for Anglo-Americans, aka European Americans, aka white people, the very, very different makeup of sense of self and understanding how the individual relates to the world around them, because this is the way our systems are structured, right? So the European American way of looking at the world is you have yourself, you have the individual, and then out here you have everyone else, including people who are incredibly important to you, who you love more than anything else in the world. So out here you have your family and children and others. You have your spirituality and religion. Even if you're a person who says God is the most important thing in my life, my number one, a Eurocentric worldview still has that spirituality and religion, outside of the individual. This is where we get, in the U.S., this thought of, this really strong thought of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. As an example, this is why we talk a lot about individualism. This is why in mental health diagnosing there's a lot of concern with enmeshment and being, dependent on other people and relying too much on other people, but we don't see a whole lot of concern about isolation and not having enough healthy relationships with other people and all that. That is all very, very culturally based worldview. So you can see, going back to the diagram of, African American sense of self, the major difference between that. In the African American community, relationships are going to be at a different level insofar as it comes to the self and understanding the self and, self-worth and self-actualization and all that jazz. Then we also have spirituality and church, which can be related but aren't necessarily the same thing. So first of all, the spirituality, that just being a sense of something outside of yourself, and that can include higher powers such as a god, but it can also just include not necessarily a higher power, but this sense of something not quite tangible, different feelings, things like intuition, right? One common phrase or way of communicating could be, I'm not feeling that type of thing. Going to the spirituality piece of including but not limited to a religious, belief in God type of a thing, but also just a sense of unity at more of a spiritual level. And that also ties in back to what I was talking about before with having a connection to a larger global Black community. If you are a Black individual, because there's this spirituality piece to it. And then the last term on this slide, church, which is talking about Judeo-Christian church. Of course, African American individuals can be of any religion, right? Islamic, Jewish, name it type of thing. That's obvious. But the vast majority of folks are in the United States are Christian, and more specifically, the vast majority are going to be Protestant as opposed to Roman Catholic. The church, the Christian church, specifically the Black Christian church, not just specifically, but also probably exclusively, unfortunately, the Black Christian church has had a huge, just unmeasurable impact on everything within the African American community. I mean, politics, economics, the resiliency, the strength, the church has been, even though it's not necessarily going to be the source of faith or the source of resilience and so on and so forth for absolutely every single individual. Again, we're talking generalizations, but this is a pretty dang big generalization that the church has been a central focal point, a source of strength, a source of resilience, a source of those strong community ties, those strong relationship ties, and strong relationship to, again, in relationship with this spirituality piece, the Creator from that specific worldview. So it's not just, a side note, thing that I believe or, a building that I go to or anything like that. It is, for many folks, the church and everything that it represents, including but not limited to God, it's so much more than God, is very much a piece of who the person is in the first place. And we have seen over the years in our country, churches be the Black American churches be leaders, Black American churches be the source of attack, the victims of attacks. It's such an integral part of the community. And so after having seen that kind of visual piece, hopefully for the visual learners out there like myself, it'll help tie together some of these terms on this bulleted list that we're just going to kind of go through one at a time. So Afrocentrism or Afrocentrism, both those terms can be used interchangeably. I went over before, it's essentially having that worldview that is common from the continent of Africa. Again, we're talking about a continent of Africa, right? So there's lots of countries, a lot of ethnicities, a lot of different tribes going on there. I'm not saying that everybody from that continent or who has ancestors from that continent looks at things exactly the same way. No, but there is a Eurocentric way of looking at things, valuing things, structuring things, as opposed to an Afro or Afrocentric way of going about things. So one example that I can give just to kind of drive that point home a little bit more, because I know it's very kind of like high level, vague overview can be, a little bit hard to understand a bit. Let's take a situation where a little, let's say 7 or 8 year old African American boy is, sitting in his class, and there's, a white teacher teaching. Not only that individual teacher has a very Eurocentric perspective from their own life experiences, but within the educational system, just like all our other systems, all our other institutions, it's built with very Eurocentric values. So let's say that this little black boy sitting in class notices that one of his fellow students is crying. And the little black boy keeps getting up out of his seat to try to comfort his classmate. Now, the teacher may at first say, oh, that's so sweet or whatever, but so-and-so, go back to your seat. Let's say that this little boy does not listen and doesn't go back to his seat, or he does go back to his seat initially, but upon seeing that his classmate is still crying and the situation has not been resolved as far as he can tell, he keeps getting up. Now, what we may be having here is a worldview clashing type of a thing, where from a Eurocentric worldview, there's a hierarchy to be respected. The teacher perhaps has already addressed what's going on with that student, and for the time being, there's nothing else that can be helped. Their mom or the dad is on the way, and for now, that's all that can be done. The teacher has handled it. Let's continue on with the lesson plan for today. And if the teacher decides that the child is in too much, the crying child is in too much distress, and the teacher, because they are in this hierarchical role of leadership that all of the students are supposed to listen to, if the teacher decides that there needs to be further intervention, then she's going to do that, right? Well, for the little boy who has grown up with potentially a more Afrocentric worldview of, it's not pull yourself up from your bootstraps, take care of yourself necessarily type of a thing. It's more, we're all in this together, we're all the same family. It may make absolutely no sense at all to just keep to sort of address the situation with the crying student, but then keep trucking along as if there's not this crying child right next to them. So from their worldview, this little boy, what it means to be a good little boy is to address the humanity that is going on in the room, right? We may see that the teacher, upon continuing to give directives, that the little boy continues to not follow because it doesn't jive with his worldview, with what he has been taught of his understanding of what are priorities, in the room. Well, now that little boy may be labeled as a troublemaker and may continue to have some of these clashes go on. And then we can, we talk about school to prison pipelines and all that may be at the brunt of different discipline, and it can have long-term ramifications for his relationships with teachers. He himself probably isn't going to be as motivated to engage in that class because he doesn't have a good relationship with his teacher, and that relationship piece is so incredibly important, while another student in the class who's not African American might be motivated by things like, stickers, gold stars, and all of that, if he doesn't have a connection to the teacher and feels like the teacher doesn't like him, that can have a big impact on his educational success. And, when I lay it all out like that, it might sound like a little far-fetched, like, okay, whatever. But this is the type of thing that we do, unfortunately, see in our educational settings, is we see these cultural clashes that take place. The teachers themselves may or may not be white. They could be whatever racial or ethnic identity, but they're functioning within this very Eurocentric system with little children who their upbringing, their understanding of what it means to be a good little girl, a good little boy, may not completely jive with that. And it is, for African American individuals, a lifelong learning process of learning how to fit yourself into this Eurocentric structure that it can be a very, very, difficult to figure out early on. So this understanding of the Eurocentrism and the Afro or Afric centrism is, it's incredibly important in order to understand where some of these cultural clashes can take place, but unfortunately can have very, very negative impacts. Hopefully that helps to clarify those terms a little bit. The next term is collectivistic culture versus individualistic. This is something that we've kind of been getting at anyways, and you could see from comparing the different diagrams. You can see even from how it's pictured, the African American collectivistic culture, where we're kind of, we're all in it together, we all impact each other, versus a much more focused on the individual European American way of looking at things. In a collectivistic culture, there's more emphasis on family units, on community units, and being a part of the larger society as a whole. That's not to say that in an individualistic culture that there's none of that going on, but it is much more about you as the individual. So if someone does something that's not appropriate, the emphasis is on that person and correcting that person or punishing that person. It's not so much taking a step back and looking at the bigger collective picture of, well, where did this maladaptive or negative behavior come from, and is there something that can be done within the community to impact this or create a better solution type of a thing. Again, it's very deeply rooted worldviews, like the example that I gave of the teacher and the little boy, where these two perspectives on how the world functions in different value systems may not necessarily always work together incredibly well. One is not necessarily wrong and the other is not necessarily right, but it is an issue when we do have a very multicultural world and multicultural society, that the overarching kind of dominant perspective is very individualistic, but we have lots and lots and lots of folks and communities that come with a more collectivistic approach to things. The next term, member value system, you may not necessarily hear this term per se, but the idea behind the term, which there can be a lot of other, words or descriptions to label this, is important. So member comes from Edwin Nichols's the philosophical aspects of cultural difference, which is a model that shows kind of different layers of how different cultural groups view the world and value different things. So member value system, as opposed to other value systems of other cultural groups, essentially means that within the Black community or African American community, that relationships are pretty much the key to everything. Relationships are the key to an individual's self-worth and an individual's relationship not only to that person, but that larger community or larger system or that larger portion of society as a whole. So relationships are incredibly important. In the examples that I gave before, it's oftentimes not just a matter of a little Black boy, not liking a teacher's approach to teaching or something like that. So for that year, they just don't enjoy science or they don't enjoy whatever. That ding and that relationship can really, really genuinely have an incredibly negative impact on that young child's motivation in school. If they feel like their teacher does not like them, then that is huge because typically speaking, in the African American community, relationships are so incredibly important, and they really, really are the basis for the self-worth of the person. It's not so much, and this isn't to say that other community groups don't value relationships, and it's not to say that an African American community in general, other things aren't also valued, but the driving forces that might be utilized in schools, and I feel like I'm picking on the educational system a lot. This is across all systems that we might interact with. But the motivational forces that might be chosen, that's potentially coming from a very Eurocentric perspective. A little white child may have been socialized in their home to want to earn, tangible things that will please their parents, to want to earn that little gold star or whatever the case may be, whereas relationships and the strength of that is more an emphasis for self-determination and self-worth. The next term we did see before, fictive kin, again, that is family that's not biologically family, essentially. That's pretty much all that is. But it is a very, very important aspect of the African American community, and it is very, very important for persons in the helping professions to understand that fictive kin, is family. Extended family, fictive kin, are very, very much just as much part of the family as the actual biological family members. And then family cohesiveness. This is a term that, again, majority culture looking at a population and sometimes assigning stereotypes or assigning negative thought processes to what they see because it's different than their own. Family cohesiveness is a huge resiliency factor, beautiful, beautiful aspect of this culture that unfortunately, in reality, gets inappropriately labeled as enmeshment. We might hear that a lot in talking about African American families, that members of the family are enmeshed with each other at like an unhealthy degree. They're too dependent on each other. All that. No. This is a cultural value that more appropriately we can call it other stuff too, but here I'm calling it family cohesiveness. This provides fluidity within the family unit, for fluidity with different roles. And again, it just goes back to that whole collectivistic thing of like, we're in this together. So different household tasks that need to be taken on there is kind of a division of responsibilities, but it's not necessarily, oh, it's this person's job within this family unit to do that. No, the family altogether has things that need to be taken care of, so we're going to all take care of it together, and we're going to rely upon each other, and we're going to draw strength from each other to continue on, and we're going to be involved with each other day in and day out in our daily lives. Family cohesiveness, not family enmeshment. We need to stop in service delivery and the helping professions see this characteristic as enmeshment, because it's not, it's a good thing. And then family integrity is about maintaining that family bond throughout the generations. This is related to respect for elders, keeping the family intact, even if maybe sometimes there are issues or concerns, maintaining that family structure. As you can see, when we talk about values within the African American community, so much of it is about family, right? Because so much is about relationships, and that is the most intimate, integral relationship is within the family. This is also a value that sometimes can have some clashes with the Eurocentric systems that we have. So just as an example, a Eurocentric perspective might be if there's someone in your family who is perhaps not like the best influence on your children, or maybe has had some shady stuff go on in their past, then you can put up really, really strong boundaries all the way up to cutting that person out of your life. Because family is important, but we have the individual in the middle and then other stuff out here as far as their worldview, right? Well, for some folks, that's not the way it is. Yes, potentially at some point things could with a family member get to a point where you do cut them out, but that's a very, very extreme thing, because you're not just yourself cutting off ties with that person where we're not going to hang out anymore, but your world and the world of that person has had a huge, huge upset. So just providing, a general example, let's say that a family becomes involved with the child welfare system, and a child is going to be placed with grandma, but uncle who's living in the home has, a record from writing a bad check 15 years ago or something like that. And because of child welfare policy, for the children to be placed with grandma, uncle would have to move out of the home because he has a record, and the children can't be placed with someone who has a record. That is ridiculous and just silly, and just a ridiculous situation to anyone when I lay it out like that. But especially when you have this very, very strong value of family integrity, of keeping the family intact, for the uncle to be punished, for the children to be punished because of a transgression, a fairly minor one, 15 years ago, like, good Lord, we're not going to break up this family because of this situation type of a thing. And so, yes, there can be boundaries and all that, but honestly, sometimes this whole talk about having super, super strong boundaries with people and, cutting people out of your life, yeah, maybe when it gets to an extreme degree, but when you have a strong value of family integrity, keeping the family intact not only for yourself but for everyone else in your family, that's just, you're both speaking the same language, technically the language of English, but it is not like jiving at all. These values are completely missing each other. And yet another example of where cultural differences can create some big clashes between communities and our Eurocentric systems. Okay, very, very quickly, I want to go through the 7 Kwanzaa values. And just to be clear, I'm not including these terms because everybody who is black in the United States celebrates Kwanzaa, because that's not true. So I'm not proposing that at all. However, the 7 Kwanzaa values, whether or not an individual or a family actually celebrates Kwanzaa, the values can be fairly reflective, again, speaking generalizations because it's not always going to be true, of some values that we have in the African American community in the United States. So very quickly, I'm going to go through these. First is umoja, which is to strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, nation, and race. And that's some of the stuff that I was talking before about the family integrity piece. There's kujija gulia, to define ourselves, name ourselves, create for ourselves, and speak for ourselves. That's talking about what I was saying before about, there's been so much oppression and so much of majority culture in the U.S. just doing everything possible to oppress this community, that this is a prideful reclaiming of we are going to name ourselves, we are going to determine for ourselves with the self-determination, what it's going to be, how we're going to be referred to, and create for ourselves these opportunities. Ujima, to build and maintain our community together and make our brothers and sisters' problems our problems and to solve them together. Again, that we're in it together sense. Your problem is my problem. Your joy is my joy. We are, united in that sense. Ujama, similar to the previous one, but as opposed to talking about collective work and responsibility, this is more talking about economics. So to build and maintain our own stores, shops, and other businesses, and to profit together from them. So the sense, again, of support within the community, including economical support. Nia, to make as our collective vocation the building and developing of our community in order to restore our people to their traditional greatness. Again, some of that reclaiming piece as well. Kuumba, to do always as much as we can in the way that we can to leave our community more beautiful and beneficial than when we inherited it. That's a very common thing as well, to leave something better than when you found it, type of an idea. Pretty common value. And imani, to believe with all our hearts in our parents, our teachers, our leaders, our people, and the righteousness and victory of our struggle. Again, some of that reclaiming piece, a lot of unity that you can hear with that. I just wanted to run over those pretty quickly. And go over the last few pieces as well with the time that we have left. The next couple of words that I'm going to go over before we finish up talking a little bit about historical trauma are again recycled from the first episode in our series, ABCs of CLC, this versus that, and it's individualism versus institutionalism. And of course, in this episode, the ism that we're talking about specifically is racism. So when we say the word racism, a lot of folks from majority culture, specifically white folks, tend to think of individualisms. This is the, saying racial slurs, race-based violence, the individual level where a person goes up to another person or goes up to another person's property and says or does something that is just overtly, obviously racist. That is a thing, unfortunately, that continues to this day and is bad, and hopefully I don't have to describe any further than that it is bad. Like, don't do it. However, there's also institutionalism, and a lot of times these days when people are talking about isms, including but not limited to racism, yeah, there's conversations about the personal racism or individual level racism, unfortunately, as well. But a lot of times we're talking about institutional racism, where entities, systems, structures are not set up to benefit everybody, and at times are even set up to exclude or discriminate against or create negative outcomes for specific communities. Sometimes institutional racism takes place because it's remnants of, old stuff that went on very, very purposefully. For example, redlining was a very purposeful way that African American as well as Hispanic Latino people were essentially forced to live in certain areas where they did not have access to loans and other ways of reaching a higher prosperity post-World War II, when white families were really, really feeling an economic boom from the GI Bill and all of that. So there was a huge disparity as far as economically what was going on. That's an example of an institutionalism that was purposefully created, that the ramifications are still felt today. So we still have institutional racism in regards to banking and housing and all these concerns. Sometimes institutional racism also comes about because no one meant to hurt the black community when they passed this law or this policy or whatever the case may be, but they were not considering the black community and didn't have the black community at the table in discussing how this specific law, policy, whatever the case may be, might have negative impacts or negative ramifications, and then we end up having an institutional racism issue from that. In institutionalisms, institutional racism, it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily require that individual people within an entity or of a specific population group have negative intentions, but it's about impact, right? And at the end of the day, if someone rams into your car and, kills your child in the back seat, do you really care if they meant to do that or not? I mean, maybe a little bit, maybe it's a little better, a little bit better to know that they didn't mean to kill your child. But at the end of the day, someone kills your child, right? And if you are having to live in a society that continues to have issues of institutional racism, okay, I guess it's sort of nice, lawmakers, policymakers, whatever the case may be, persons in leadership, that you didn't mean to cause these really, really negative impacts in my life, the life of my family, the life of my community, but you're still doing it, okay? So that's what we're talking about with institutional racism, or isms. And then finally today, the last piece that I wanted to go over is historical trauma. On the slide, I chose a quote from a member of the Lakota tribe. This issue of historical racism is a concern across many, many groups within the United States, including but not limited to the African American community. And what are some of the traumas in the past that this community has gone through? Of course, slavery, but also, the Black Codes, the Compromise of 1877, Jim Crow, lynchings, race riots in Tulsa, the Rosewood Massacre, medical issues, the Tuskegee experiments. During slavery, there was a mental disorder for slaves called drapetomania, which was a, quote-unquote mental illness where slaves were, quote-unquote, obsessed with gaining their freedom. You could just go on all day long, going back hundreds of years, all the way up to present day, of different traumas that this community has experienced in our country. The whole idea of, slavery is in the past, we don't need to talk about that anymore. First of all, it's been the majority of the existence of our country still today. And second of all, it's not the only thing that has been a trauma to this community. So historical trauma is essentially when at least one or potentially continuous, which with this community is absolutely continuous, traumas take place at a community level and those traumas are passed down. And so it's related to intergenerational trauma. So think about, and I'm only providing this as an example to kind of clarify what historical trauma is and is not. Imagine that someone went through really, really intensive abuse, and then they are suffering from some of the post-traumatic conditions from that, and then they have children, and the child grows up in a situation of having some of the leftover ramifications from that abuse, and then it can be passed on generationally. Well, there's community trauma, where it's not just within one family unit where someone is traumatized and has to deal with ramifications from that, but the entire community around the person has gone through that as well. And the ramifications of that trauma can be passed down across generations as well. So there's a socialization piece where, although there's so much resilience and strength, there can potentially be some leftover ramifications from the absolute most heinous crimes against men and women, known. There was never any going back and, there weren't apologies and made and, mental health care provided, appropriate mental health care provided for all those tragedies. This is actually speaking to a theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome, which there's actually a book written about it. I highly recommend reading about that as well, about historical trauma that has taken place in a number of different populations, the very, very specific historical trauma of chattel slavery, and then the terrible crimes against this population since chattel slavery in our country, how that may have been having a long-term impact. And so recognizing that, understanding that, healing is really, really difficult to take place when we still, unfortunately, in our country don't acknowledge just the depth of the long-term ramifications of this specific period of time of slavery in our country, as well as some things after that. So, I apologize. That last piece I went through fairly quickly. Hopefully I did a little bit of justice in explaining it. I had hoped to have a little bit more time to expound on that a bit. We are already, unfortunately, over time, so thank you everyone who was able to stay on and stay with us. I very, very much appreciate your time. Thank you again, everybody, so much for tuning in today to this episode of the ABC of CLC webinar series. I very, very much appreciate your time and hope that you have a wonderful day. If you do, again, have any questions or concerns, please do feel free to reach out.